Well, welcome back. All right, if you missed the results at the top of our newscast, Proposition 1, which would have kept current rules for ride-sharing drivers in place, failed. Now the city can start fingerprinting them. With 100% of the votes in, Uber and Lyft in statements say they are going to keep their promise to stop service tomorrow morning. Michael Kanin with the Austin Monitor joining us live with Insight. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Thank you for being here. I'm sure you're here because you've been covering this issue for months. And I know we just mentioned Uber and Lyft say that they're going to stop operating tomorrow. They're using a little bit different terminology. Lyft says they're going to pause operations. Uber says we're out. The mayor, Adler, says let's sit down at the table. Do we know what's going to happen in the coming days?
The short answer for that is no. I think we can guess that there'll be some. I imagine there'll be some attempt on the city's part to approach Lyft and Uber and see whether or not they'll sit down again and get going with some kind of conversation. I'm sure your viewers will remember that before this all went down, the mayor did have a memorandum of understanding between both companies, signed by both companies, that would have avoided the whole thing. It's just the council didn't get it passed. So I imagine that could be a starting point. I mean, who knows? Something like this tends to get people even more entrenched than they were before, and I imagine there's some bad feelings, at least in a couple corners here. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we heard from one of the drivers she drives for Uber and Lyft, and I talked to a driver also who drives for Uber and Lyft earlier this week, or last week, I guess rather, and they've been in the dark throughout this whole process. They get a lot of communication from Uber and Lyft about everything else, but said we have not received one email, one message about what's next. Even Uber and Lyft, they didn't want to address it before the election. They wanted all the focus to be on Prop 1, helping voters understand exactly what they were voting for on election day. They didn't even want to go there. Do we have to look at other cities like San Antonio who've gone through a similar situation to try to predict what's going to happen next?
And some might suggest that this is just sort of an inevitable sort of process where, you had to go through this end and then now we'll get to a compromise. I don't know. The way that these folks, the way that Lyft and Uber have tended to operate has been, they believe that the regulations are an impediment to their business practices. I think they honestly believe that, and they worry about national fallout, maybe global fallout, if something like this happens. Which now we get to see. Is this something that other cities are going to try and do? All told, though, I mean, I think we have to consider the fact that there's a market for this stuff here, and I think it will be awfully difficult for anybody to say no to that. But who knows, really, who knows?
Yeah, and the amount of money that Uber and Lyft bring in just from Austin alone. In your personal opinion, do you think that they are just going to go away for a little bit, try to work this out with the city, and then they'll be back?
Boy, personal opinions, I think we've been writing about this for so long over at the Monitor that I think all of my opinions are jumbled up in my head with all kinds of different things. I think, my gut says that they'll be back in some kind of way. And if they're not, there'll be some other folks that try to step up. There are, obviously folks, pointed out before the vote that there hasn't been really a successful company coming in to do what they do in any place, and maybe that's just because they're so ubiquitous, they're so everywhere. But we're gonna see. I have no idea what happens next. It's one of those things where it could be just a number of things.
Yeah, and I'm curious about this because I did a story this last week about this, and no one could really answer the question. Uber and Lyft weren't going to go into this area because the election hadn't happened yet. But Uber and Lyft operate outside of the city of Austin in Central Texas, so they're in the suburbs. They're picking people up in Round Rock, San Marcos, taking them to the airport. I wanted to know if those operations will continue, and if the point of origin where you get in the Uber car is what's important, and then the drop-off location not so much. So when Uber and Lyft say we're out of Austin at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning or 5 a.m. depending on the company, will people in the suburbs still be able to use the service, and can they get dropped off in the city? And nobody could answer that question.
That's a great question. I mean, for one thing, you'd have to think about enforcement. I mean, the way that the city sort of started to get them to comply with airport regulations. With they did a sting. They had people from the transportation department calling Lyft and Uber, ordering up Lyft and Ubers. I mean, you have to do something like that to really figure it out. And everybody, I think it's very difficult to say what that's going to look like going forward. I think that you know, like we've discussed, nobody really knows what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be, I imagine that it would be a more tolerant sort of atmosphere while we sort of try to get this stuff worked out. But then again, if you drop somebody off in the city, how are they going to get back?
Yes, exactly.
And you know, and if you, I imagine there's some suburban and exurban buses that you could take, but it creates another set of issues.
Yeah, for sure. And the Uber driver would just be there and have to drive all the way back to where they came from, and that's not good for their profit. Well, thank you so much for your insight this morning, Michael Kanin with the Austin Monitor.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.